apparently the litigation and everything has been a real disaster. And he was asking me if I knew anybody who was versed in construction forensics. And I said, well, Phil, you're in luck. I'm going to my user group tonight, and I've got a room full of people from various firms. So if any of you or anybody you know at one of your firms or a friend of yours in the industry or whatever is, they want to, I guess, create a 3D reconstruction of what went on and somehow use this in the litigation to try and prove their case. So I said, it's way out of my realm. I mean, but not anything I've done, but you know, didn't know if any of you had a contact. If you do, if you know of anybody, think of anybody, just grab me before you leave tonight, and I'll get your information and I'll pass it on to my friend Phil, and I'm sure he'll be grateful. So, so there's that sort of unrelated piece of news there. I'm going to be at Midwest University in Minnesota in March. They have a conference in Minnesota in March, like. Yeah, I've been doing it for like the last couple of years now. So it's like a mini AU. How many of you go to Autodesk University? AU, right? So it's literally an Indian casino too. So it's like everything about it is like a mini AU. It's, you know, including the venue. So anyway, I'm actually going to be doing a Dynamo session and a family editor session there. So you know, if you're interested, check it out. It's a little cheaper than AU, a little easier to get to maybe. Well, I don't know. Vegas is not hard to get to, but the March part maybe is a little off-putting, but you know, you're going to probably be inside the whole time anyway, and they do heat the place, so it's okay. Yeah. Anyway, so that's coming up. I don't know of any other events that are happening in the near future, but you know, certainly if anybody knows of anything that they want me to share, you can always send me an email, and I'll. I try to be respectful of not over blasting the group, but you know, I can certainly communicate with the group if somebody has something that you think would be of interest to them. So that's all the sort of housekeeping that I have. Ryan is involved with BIM implementation research and training here at Clayco BatesForum. He's going to tell you about the whole history of the firm here, because apparently they're actively absorbing other firms and changing. So he'll give you the lowdown on that. But he's going to share with us tonight some stuff that he's been doing recently in Dynamo. He just reached out to me a few weeks ago and says, hey, I've been doing some cool stuff. Do you think the group would be interested? And I'm like, hell yes. So so his second time. He's our first alumni presenter. So, really? You know, thanks for that. Yeah, I believe so. I think you're the only one that, no, Zach Crone. Okay. But Zach only has presented for us once in person. The other time was remote. So I will call that a 1.5, right? Okay. I mean, you're the first live presenter that we've had twice. So anyway, take it away, Ryan. Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, my name's Ryan. I work for Clayco and BatesForum and all the other companies associated with it. We are a bunch of different companies, and we've started acquiring a few more. So Clayco is kind of the umbrella company. They're a construction company, design build. Historically, Forum Studio has been the design side of Clayco. We recently acquired Bates Architects about getting pretty close to a year now. And then very recently acquired Lamar Johnson Collaborative, which is a smaller Chicago-based office. So we're growing in both our St. Louis and Chicago markets. We have a presence in San Francisco now, and are doing projects all over the country. If you see some of the pictures around here, we're doing the renovation on Sears Tower right now. That is a big site currently. That's with Gensler. So one of the benefits of being a large design build firm is that we get to build projects by Studio Gang and Gensler and lots of good architects, but we also get to design things that someone else is going to build. So we're both working for our construction company and designing our own stuff that's getting built by other people. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. We have a CRG, it's a realty company, so we can buy the property and develop it ourselves. We can design it and then build it. And so kind of keep everything within the same umbrella. Ventana is here in Chicago. They're a curtain wall company. What's that? Yeah. And Concrete Strategies is if you buy concrete in Missouri, they probably are the ones procuring it. So they do a lot of civil design and just everything related to concrete. So, and then Drawn and Treehouse. Drawn is more of a technology, apps and stuff. We're not really sure what they do. But Treehouse is kind of our venture capitalist group that kind of starts different things. We used to have a drone company. We recently sold that to Precision Hawk, I believe. So yeah, this is our group. Our design side is now these 3 companies, and we're in the process of merging everything together into one large design group that all works together, which makes creating Revit templates really fun and challenging. As soon as we got about halfway through designing our template, we acquired another one, and now we're kind of going through that process all over again. So standards and how we do things, it's amazing how many little things are completely different between offices. So maybe I'll try to submit something for AU just on how to merge standards. Within the design side, we have architecture, interiors, planning and landscape, which we're going to talk about tonight, advanced strategies, which is we'll talk about on the next slide, technical assurance group, and then we have a model shop here in Chicago that makes awesome models. In the building? In the building, yeah. So laser cutting, 3D printing. What else is he? He kind of does everything. Wood shop, metal shop is going to be in the next iteration. They just do a lot of fun stuff. You can see some models out in the lobby, but there's one guy running it, but a few other people working on it. They do a lot of fun stuff. So first thing I want to talk about, there's going to be mostly 3 topics, but this is kind of an introductory topic of what I see as Dynamo's workflow, because I know there's people from my office here that has not used Dynamo. So the whole process that I see for Dynamo is that information comes in and information goes out, and how you manipulate it is how you actually utilize Dynamo. So there's really, well, that goes backwards. When you get down to a single node, it's just information in, information out. If you use Dynamo at all, it's second nature. But it's what you do with it, which is contained in the node. It's kind of where the power comes from. So there's various different types of inputs, and then how do you utilize that to create an output? And are you creating something that you are thinking about ahead of time, or are you just kind of exploring with what you got to kind of create something new? So when I'm doing Dynamo scripts, I group things a lot, and it's the same kind of process. So you have information that's coming into a group, such as lines to create a shape, and then you have an output. So like this one is creating a surface from some lines. So I probably started on this one, I started with some points to create lines, to create a shape, to create a form, and then from there you can create architecture. So as long as you can methodically move through the process, it gets a lot easier to work with, instead of just having lines going everywhere, and it's hard to keep track of. And I have a couple ideas on how to keep things cleaned up for Dynamo that I use that I'll share with you. And if you have other ideas, I'd be happy to hear them, because I'm always trying to make things more efficient. And we'll go from there. So when you get to a larger graph, of course, your input then becomes the Revit model, Excel documents, whatever information you have, and then your output is actually probably the same thing, either Revit model, Excel, basically anything that can work with Dynamo is your input and your output. So the first topic we're going to talk about is advanced strategies. This is one of our groups here. I think they're mostly in St. Louis. I don't think there's any in Chicago. They are primarily, their job is focused on helping clients know what they want. They go in and interview everyone in an office, find out their patterns, and figure out how much space someone really needs. If they need individual spaces or if they need collaborative spaces. They go through and do a really, really good job. And sometimes they're walking around a building once every hour. They have to get around the entire building, and then they make like these giant graphs and all this fun stuff. They don't use AutoCAD at all, but they've recently started learning Revit. And now we're introducing Dynamo into that as well. And we'll kind of get into some of what we're doing for them. But they're probably one of our largest growing segments. I think 2 years ago they had probably 2 people, and now they're at 10 to 12. But then they hire temporary people to go out and do all the data acquisition. So when they have a job, they'll hire 10 people to work for 2 weeks to basically walk around with iPads and figure out what's going on in a building. So one of the things they do is they create studies of departments. I mean, this is kind of basic Revit stuff. What type of people are working in certain areas. This particular project is a really large corporation, and they're moving people from a lot of buildings into one building, and they don't really know what they have. So they have a lot of, probably 3,000 people. And trying to model all of this in Revit is time consuming, especially with the amount of information they want, because each person probably has about 40 pieces of information assigned to that person. So like where they sit, what department they're in, who's their boss, bunch of ID numbers, addresses, all that fun stuff. And they wanted to be able to graphically show who's in what department and maybe who's in charge of this people, and try to get that, like if John Smith is in charge of 40 people who are spread about 20 buildings or whatever, can we get all those people into one area? So can we color code all those people in one color? And then when we design the new space or renovate the old, like a different space, can we get those people together? So we decided to try it with Dynamo. And it's a very basic Dynamo script. It's just an Excel push. So they acquired all this information, and then we pushed it through Dynamo back into Revit. So these are all massing families with a bunch of information. So names, IDs, secondary departments, primary departments. And to type this out manually for 3,000 people is super time consuming.
How did you get those things then? Did you just do a bunch of
I whited out the name of the company.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you had learned something about the way. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't know how you did that. Okay.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yeah. It's just white.
All right.
And then we also have our information. So BatesForum, unique ID. We assigned an ID number to each person. And I can show you the Excel file here. So, I mean, it is super long. If I zoom out in Excel and get to the width, I still have to scroll quite a bit just to get all the employees for this.
Does somebody have to input that money?
So this is what, all this information comes from I think on this one they hired about 20 people. And they went through and went to each office and like typed in information on each person. So these are all temporary people that were hired to do data input in the field. And that in itself is a whole different puzzle that I don't really understand, because there's a verification process and all that fun stuff. But at the end of the day, it's let me see if I can get back to my top here. So you have addresses and locations and interview leaders and building levels and business divisions and primary departments and all that stuff, which is a lot of data that you can work with, but it's a lot of data to acquire and a lot of data to work with in Revit. So the Dynamo script is actually really light. We only pushed this much data, so this is 12-ish columns that were from that schedule. And this is really my first attempt at learning where is it located? using, this is actually Spring nodes, their dictionary by keys. If you haven't done Excel pushes to Revit, this is a really powerful node because all you need to do is to have a key value that's the same in both Revit and Excel. And once you do that, then all the information basically flows through that key. So we had someone in our office that went through that one of the things that was nice, there was a CAD drawing that we could underlay, and it had all the mail stops, basically. That's the unique user ID that we used. That was our key. And that key exists on the Excel spreadsheet somewhere. I believe it's this one right here. So that mail stop, and it's something we created because it's a combination of building level and workstation. And we had a CAD drawing. So we created a family in Revit, and then sometimes I get annoyed when Dynamo always on top. So someone populated one node in all these boxes and then push 15 other pieces of data into it, as long as they can get that one key connection for Revit.
Is this 1.3?
This is 2.0.
You have the Springs package in it?
I have the Springs package in it, yeah.
I thought that was, is Springs different than Spring Nodes?
I think it's the same. I think Spring Nodes is the same.
That's the Lucent building.
What's that?
That's the former Lucent Navistar.
That is Navistar.
The building is pretty. The floor plate is when you zoom up.
Yeah, I'm having trouble navigating here, but it is just a massive. It's a massive amount of information, and then so the CAD drawing that you can see underlay has their phone number, their name, and the mail stop, but it doesn't include which level they're on. So we had to first run one script that combined the level with the mail stop, and that created kind of the official key. And then from that key, we could start pushing all this information. So really, once you do it for one, you can do it for others. So it's really, this is all that you had to really do in Dynamo to push that much information in there. So when I'm building stuff, try to accurately describe what you're doing in each group. I use caps if it's an action, so like select, create, all that stuff for my groups. Bringing data from Excel, again, just some basic Dynamo stuff, and then acquiring the key that's in that Excel file, reading the key from Revit, and then kind of pushing everything through this node. And it just looks for the match, and then it loads the rest of the columns. And that saved them. I mean, they probably couldn't even do this project. We kind of played with it on a previous project that had 200 people. They could do that. It would probably take them a day of data entry to make a Revit model for it. So we've actually played with the Revit part before, and they're like, all right, what are we going to do now with 3,000 people instead of 200 people? So this is kind of the progression of how this process came to be. So just, this is the first time, these group of people, they never used Revit until probably 6 months ago. They definitely never used Dynamo before. So the nice thing with having all these different companies working with us and various groups is that we can make inroads in places that we would never really think about before. Even with our designers, they don't really use Dynamo right now just because they kind of know what they want to do and how to do it. But with people that don't really know how to use Revit or Dynamo, it's an option, and then it kind of goes from there. So this is kind of how I've been figuring out how to bring Dynamo to the office. Last time I presented, I think it was industrial projects. I have a script that can basically draw a whole industrial building. Our industrial group didn't really take to it because they felt like it took away from their job. And it wasn't super flexible. Like we have special corners and stuff. And then like a month ago, they're like, all right, so how do we use this Dynamo script again? because we're getting a lot more projects, and we just want to kind of, yeah. So Alba's in our industrial group. She was in that conversation. So we're kind of now starting that conversation again. So we have about 3 or 4 different inroads. Unfortunately, the architecture, like the fancy designs and facades, those guys are kind of doing their own thing in SketchUp and Rhino right now. So we're kind of working with landscape and workplace and industrial. And I do a lot of stuff on the VDC side, just checking models. I find Dynamo very helpful. And running scripts off of Clarity. You can run Dynamo scripts inside of Clarity on a regular basis to give you lots of information. So the other thing that we can start to do is tie that information to like Power BI. Is kind of those are like the 4 different ways that we're kind of using Dynamo at this point. So yeah, this is kind of a basic script, but it was a lifesaver. I don't think they would have been able to use it in the way they wanted to. Really, any model geometry if they didn't have this.
Why do you have that watch node? Just as far
That
as
is a good question.
organization goes,
So
there's a way you-
we'll talk about it in the next script. Watch nodes, and I also use code blocks to pass information through. But watch nodes are great because I can't right click on this and freeze it. But if I have a watch node where information is going through that, I can freeze that watch node, and it basically freezes everything downstream. So I'll create pass-through nodes where all my information is getting collected as the input, and it goes through a block, and then it goes into the output side, and I can freeze that node, and it just freezes everything downstream. But if it's going into a group, you can't freeze that and control it as easy. So I'll throw watch nodes in. And rather than just have it sitting off to the side just to look at information, I'll pass through it so it stops things.
Do you know I refer to that as an extension cord.
Yeah.
So if you think about an extension cord, you just pull the plug or you plug it, it's just a convenient way to, it's also really useful when your graph is like this long and you're constantly scrolling back and forth to pull that wire from over here to over here. So I'll just put a watch or a code or whatever. That's an extension cord to get that output to some other part of the graph where it's more convenient. So for both of those reasons, it feels like an extension cord to be like plugging your slides together.
So on
Yeah.
this one, what was kind of the outcome or deliverable? Was it just a model with the data?
Yeah, so it's model and data, and what they're trying to get to is to have, this is like their inspiration. She's like, I want something like this. Like I want to see in color the different departments. This is not ours, by the way. This is inspiration. What we actually output was some very simple colored graphics because we're trying to acquire how much space people actually need, and then we could create other massing that equals that space. It's not quite as easy as saying, okay, we have 600 square feet of this, then go create me a box that has 600 square feet and place it where I need it to be. Basically, we output a bunch of information of what we had. If I go back to Revit, one of the big outputs was scheduling. So they had schedules for, this is level 5, and just, here's the different space types, here's what type of room it is, here's how many of those they have, here's the family type, so we know what the size is, and then the seat count. So some of these boxes had 4 seats in it, and how much square footage is in it. So again, very beginner steps for people that don't really use Revit. So they're still learning how to use Revit. Also, schedules is a really good way to introduce Revit to people because we'll talk about that when we get to landscape. With Workplace, or Advanced Strategies, it was a really good way for them to get some scheduling output. And they're very well versed on how to use VLOOKUP on Excel and pull that information, but learning how to do it in Revit and then manipulated things here, slightly different. They could do it a little quicker for some things in Revit, and then they do some things in Excel. So again, it's like doing information from lots of sources and being able to utilize it. So let's see if there's any other.
How much of a time savings
I think with this, they couldn't have done it without it. Probably 2 weeks is what she threw at me. Was the amount of information they would have spent doing it. And they didn't have that time. Their deadline was like in a week to do it. So we spent probably a day trying to figure out how to get it. And then I told them what I needed. And they spent a day setting up the Revit model to get those mail stops ready. And then while I was working on the Dynamo script, they gave me like a temporary Excel file, and then it worked on the first time. So that was actually unique for Dynamo.
How long did it take to run?
It actually goes really quick, probably 30 seconds. So for 3,000 units, 15 bits of data, it was actually really quick. I was surprised.
It's assigning parameters, it's not creating any.
It was assigning values to parameters, not creating parameters themselves. Yeah.
So those were things that were already in the model.
Yeah, so I went through and created the families that had parameters. So we had a whole shared parameters file for them. She actually now can create shared parameters. So 2 weeks later, she came back and she says, I've added these parameters. Can we run the script again? So I went through and I just copied this down, changed the column that we were adding, ran it, and it was done in an hour. From when she originally asked it, we had it ready to go. So it's now become a back and forth thing. We can add things, push it in. The workflow's actually pretty good. So landscape, urban planning, these two are landscape. They do a lot of good stuff. A lot here in Chicago. This is actually Fort Wayne. We're doing a whole riverfront development. And as you can see, a lot of it is Photoshop coloring, CAD drawings. And that's very typical for landscape across the country. We found one person that writes blogs on landscape for Revit, Lauren Schmidt, I believe. Very good tutorials. She presents at AU. She presents at Built this year, so I had a good chance to talk to her. Sophia, who's not here tonight, absolutely loves her. Reads all her stuff. And Sophia has kind of been the driving force. These two, Jesse and Jameson, are getting there. You guys are both using Revit. So we've introduced Revit to landscape about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And have now, so our landscape department is about 15 people, 3 here in Chicago, 12 in St. Louis. Historically, everyone's CAD, except for one person in St. Louis. He's been using Dynamo since I arrived about 4 years ago. But he could never get traction, just because there's so many details and just the way things are all set up. And Revit's not very good with landscape in general. They don't have a lot of categories and families and stuff for the needs of landscape and urban planning. Just so it didn't have much traction to get going. We introduced it to Sophia and Jesse about a year ago when we were training Revit, and you guys fell in love with the scheduling, I think was the key. And so we started creating templates and getting all that stuff to kind of overcome some of the hardships of using landscape in Revit. There's still some hardships with using it, and we're going to talk about our most recent addition to that, which I don't even think you guys are using yet, but we're going to use it soon. So this is just kind of some examples. These are 2 different projects, but this is an actual Revit model and then taken through Photoshop. This is kind of how things look in Revit. So if there's a shrub or something, we'll draw some floors, we'll get the right height in there, and then we'll offset it to kind of give you a rough estimate of what things are going to look like and how things are going to look. We don't really have 3-dimensional trees yet, although we've been talking about getting some things. We can kind of talk about that in a little bit. yeah, so one of the big challenges is that it's always in CAD, and it's because we have a lot of details in CAD. I think landscape people think in CAD a lot better. The GIS is obviously a CAD-based program, and everyone has a lot of knowledge with that. And what we found is quantification is a lot easier in Revit. So counting trees, counting areas of floors, obviously. So we do all of our sod and shrubs and basically all of our smaller plantings as floors. We're not quite to the level of Lauren Schmidt where we are using Dynamo to drape floors over topography, but we're getting there. I think as soon as they learn Dynamo, then we're going to get there, because I think Sophia's probably going to try to start learning that soon, but that's a little bit more complicated. Right now we're just doing flat floors and trying to get the heights right, and because we also have soils and irrigation and all that stuff. We're not doing layers within the floors. We're actually doing separate floors. So if a soil is going across the whole site, we'll just model that whole thing rather than try to build layers within it. And we'll kind of see why here when we get into the Dynamo script. But yeah, we're scheduling things, quantifying individual shrubs and trees, and then drawing floors to capture those areas. But what do you do when you have 200 plant types and you have to create a floor for each, or you have a bunch of different shrubs? Do we build a template with all of those already pre-built, which is kind of what we had started doing? And the problem we have with, or we had to build it for each project, where we would import the different symbols and botanical names, cultivars, common names. I mean, there's a lot of information that goes into landscape design. And just to show you one of these folders that we have, these files that we have a master list that one of the guys in St. Louis has been kind of building his entire life, that we've now taken and expanded upon. And it's, there's different types of the same thing with different cultivars, different common names. They all have a height value and a spread value and spacing. And when you're doing areas, you kind of need a multiplier. If the spacing is ivory foot on center, then your multiplier is 1. Okay. That makes it easy. So if we can have that multiplier in Excel, then we can maintain consistency as people start modeling this in Revit. So caliper of tree, the shape of the tree is something we just added, how it's installed. So this is bulb and bald umbrella. I'm learning a lot of landscape stuff recently. And as we go to there's a lot of different tabs. So like evergreen trees has their own understories, obviously. Evergreen shrubs. And we try to create a key value, much like the last one, because we're pushing stuff through that we need to look at the key value to then push the rest of this for. So shrubs and grasses and sedges and herbaceous forbs. But one of the things that we also have, let's go back to the canopy trees, is that this is expandable. So we have the time of year and what color the tree is and the time of year. Yeah, a lot of information. It's insane how much information's in here. This is like the water usage. Is it partial shade, full shade? And then we have just lots of little bits of information. So is it Missouri native? This guy was based in St. Louis. Is it good for birds and butterflies? And so like stuff they'll look up and stuff they kind of want to review as they're picking trees. There's a lot of information here. Now, what I'm using it for, really, I only need the this information, because this is what I'm actually pushing through. But maybe down the road, we'll use the coloring and that kind of stuff for something else that we'll talk about in a second.
This is probably the biggest reason why landscape architects don't love it.
Yeah.
Just to build all that from scratch takes forever.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely forever.
I mean, there's a lot of research. Like one of the things that's on there is a link. So if I go to that, it's a link to this tree and what colors it is, and there's data sheets, and I mean, there's a lot of information just on this one tree. Here's the spread, here's the height, here's the zone it thrives in, I guess. It's usually a range, yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of information here to utilize, and how do we utilize that? So let's get this back up. So yeah, consistency. So if we're inputting things in a Revit and you misspell something, that's an issue. So if we can push this information in, it's obviously going to maintain consistency. One of the other things that we had, so that the consistency and all that stuff is one of the, I'll jump into Revit really quick and show you actually what's being the result. So this is a look at our 2019 template as we're kind of putting things together. So we'll have all of our floor types. This is probably going to get parsed out into different templates, but I'm just trying to keep everything together. So annotation, symbols, all that fun stuff. The focus of this is on landscape. So we have a floor type for annuals, bulbs, vines, shrubs, ornamental grasses, sod, perennials, and planting mixes. So they each have different hatches. So when you model them, you can get a site plan that you can differentiate and tag and get areas from. Let's see, 2019. The script that we ran is a little bit different because it's just reading from Excel and then bringing information in. And it's asking which plants do I want. So the goal that we're going to have is that I come through this list and fill this parameter in and say I want that plant and that plant and that plant. And in Excel, it's highlighting so that you can visually see what we want. And I already have some selected here. So they just turn green for what we want. And then when we come over to Revit, it's going to duplicate a existing generic floor and then create another floor type and then push all the information from that Excel sheet into it. So it gathers the data from the type mark and it's filtered based on that yes parameter, and then it's creating a new floor type, duplicating from this one. I'm kind of working with how I want to duplicate. For right now, it's just select element and duplicate that. And this, I'm just using this to rename it. So the type mark in this case is just this value over here. So each plant has a unique value, which one of our, Megan down in St. Louis, went through and just filled everything out. So everything has a unique value. Typically it changes, but now we can have a standardized naming. So it creates a floor type and then it sets that as the type mark. And maybe I can ask a question to you guys. When you're putting information from multiple locations into the same object, I'm passing through, so really it's kind of doing this. I don't know if the information can split and if it would go faster or if it should go sequentially. I don't really know. So what I'm doing is I'm setting the type mark, and then that element is then setting the botanical name, and then it's setting the cultivar, setting the common name, the height, and the method of installation and spacing. So we could,
Might be able to build a list.
yeah. So like we have all the, like we're gathering the data from Excel, basically filtering it. My list management skills, I would say, is intermediate at best. So that's kind of why my scripts kind of balloon out and then they go forward that way.
Yeah, the only challenge with that is when you have to go back, now all these other ones that you copied have to be updated too.
Right, yeah. So I'm still working through it. I'll learn some stuff and probably completely redo this in 6 months. Who knows? That's just the way that Revit or Dynamo is. You just kind of.
I think every time I open a Dynamo script, I look at it and go, what was I thinking when I put that together.
We'll talk about that in the next topic because I completely rechanged it. So yeah, what this does is then it pushes all this information. So when I ran it, it took the deciduous shrubs and then it created a duplicate with that information. And if I edit type, it's got all these pieces of information, if it had that information in Excel filled in. So,
but it keeps the same hatch for all deciduous.
Yeah, so deciduous would have the same hatch, and then herbaceous forbs would have the same hatch.
Yeah, that makes sense because you run out of hatches pretty quick.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do have, I'm just going to jump into.
I have to step on. Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
One of the things we're kind of playing with is having different materials on it. So the shrubs is a little bit darker, the grasses, and some sod, and then the rest are just kind of a generic planting thing. And as we evolve, we'll probably update, much like the Excel file is kind of changing over time. We'll probably change this over time. I also don't want to overload the template with 50 different JPEGs or whatever.
So you Lumion covered that? Have you ever tried to like integrate Lumion with this?
Not yet. Just because this computer and Lumion don't get along too well. I have a tower that I'll play with, but I haven't really gotten there yet. We have a couple other people that use it a lot better, so usually I just give them the task of doing it rather than doing it myself. I'll play around with different tools, but then I don't really utilize them all the time. Also, one of my favorite things with 2019 is that perspective, that full screen perspective. And I don't know, have you played with the new materials at all?
But yeah, I mean, I always try and use them now.
I'm trying to use them, but there's not a lot.
It's
Like,
not a lot.
you can't really create it from scratch either.
Well, yeah, they use different. Yeah,
It's
I
different.
agree. I try to use them, but it's still not quite all there yet. But that's changing soon.
Yeah. So that's where we're at with landscape right now. They're going to start using it hopefully soon. And then, but the question I always have with Dynamo is what can we do with it now? Like, what's the next step? Can we take this information that we have already and push it even farther? So this is an example of a situation we had with a client where the client didn't understand that leaves change, that colors change, that they're not going to have red flowers in the fall when they're there in the spring. And so you guys put together like 6 or 7 different renderings at different times of the year, and basically went through and photoshopped a lot of stuff. So this is a great example, and it's a pretty awesome job. So different renderings, obviously spring, fall, winter. Just to kind of show you, and hopefully she was satisfied. I'll go back one. So what obviously that color came from is some of these colors that were in here. So we're gathering, and a lot of this information, there's colors obviously for all of them, but a lot of it's in your guys' heads. So Megan's trying to go through and put stuff down into this Excel sheet. She went through the canopy trees and has added it to all of them and what times of year they have. So my thought process is, we have all this information, can we do anything with it? So talking with Sophia yesterday, one of her favorite people, designers, is, I lost my icon here. Piet Holdolf. Yes. Who does, there we go. Really good artwork as well as landscape. So like this is a great diagram for this design, and he does a really good job. Like what I've noticed is with like different heights and layering and different times of year, things look really good as well, just with the form and the texture of plants and everything. And he did the Lure Garden here in Chicago as well. And this is like, what's it called? The something river, Salvia River. So it's like a river of purple that's running through the green. So he's got a lot of cool stuff and really interesting layout design. So has anyone heard of the Voronoi diagram? So if you've seen the map of the United States where all the points of the capitals and like distances from the capital, basically it creates spaces where everything inside of it is closest to that point. So as the points move farther apart, the spaces get bigger. It's very organic. I'm just using it as like a way to create a diagrammatic abstraction. You can see it in different things. This is obviously drafts, and architecture students use it quite a bit because it creates something that's interesting, but completely impractical to build because it's very expensive. But they don't have to worry about that. So it usually shows up in student work. Although it did make it into the School of Mathematics at the University of Bristol. It also shows up in science. So this is the London cholera deaths of 1854. And they didn't know anything about germs back then. So one guy mapped out every instance of cholera that was going on. And they basically discovered that it was surrounding this particular pump of water. And everyone was getting their water from that pump and contracted the disease. Well, someone came back years later and overlaid it with a Voronoi diagram, and it basically overlays with it. And it's really interesting because then you can put that further where something's happening, you can kind of input different inputs of what's going on and see what overlays and kind of figure out information. So what I took that for is, what if we take the information from the Excel spreadsheet and created an abstract Voronoi diagram that uses the colors of those shapes and then changes colors throughout the year. So it'll just like fade in from one to another. This was not done in Dynamo. I just used After Effects and kind of punched in a bunch of colors. But you could kind of create these abstract stained glass stuff using square footages and stuff. So that's kind of like my next thought of where we could take this information. Who knows if we'll get there, but I just thought it was kind of fun to play with. And let me just make sure I got enough time. So 15 minutes to go.
Kind of like heat map.
Kind of, yeah. So there's actually, if you look up Voronoi, like create Voronoi diagrams online, you can actually get like interactive diagrams that you can play around with.
Would you just do like a random scatter to generate points?
Yeah, like this one will create a random scatter, and you can actually start moving things around, and it will calculate everything in there. So it's just something that was kicking around in my head as a way to generate some interesting shapes. And Dynamo has a Voronoi node in one of the packages. I don't know which one, but I'm not very good about putting that information down, even though I should be. So yeah, that's it for landscape. Does anyone have any questions on? Do you guys have any questions?
How do you use floors, and do you ever try to use the topo surface and subregions and all that?
Yeah, we tried using topo surfaces. I never really liked it. It's hard to manipulate. With the floors, we're mostly doing flat-ish surfaces, so we could kind of get away with it. But you can also do points. One of the things that Lauren Schmidt's doing is that you kind of take the overall topography and then it'll basically drape the floor and kind of match it down to that. The nice thing with floors is you can do a slab edge around it, so you can do curbs and gutters really easily with a slab edge and just kind of do parking lots pretty quickly. But yeah, we'll explore three-dimensional draping pretty soon and just kind of take it to the next level. I've always found the site tools lacking in Revit, so maybe someday they'll be good. But for now, they don't seem to put a lot of effort into it. So
It's a small profession.
right, that's
you don't
the
have the money
Well, and
Developer structure.
the way that architecture has been slow updating a lot of different things, like it's even slower for landscape for sure. So we're barely getting stuff in architecture that we've been asking for 10 years. So 20, yeah. But maybe someday, who knows? Until then, we gotta write our own. We gotta create our own tools that kind of do it for us. So that's where Dynamo comes in, and it can do it that way. Last topic is something I played around with over Christmas. My dad's a geometry teacher, so I was wearing the Dynamo shirt that had obviously the Dynamo logo in it, and just kind of got the idea to create the Dynamo logo inside Dynamo. And then from that, what's that?
Is that recursive?
Right. So from that, I had some ideas of like just thoughts I had about Dynamo. So one of the things that it kind of helped me think about Dynamo too, like how do you approach the problem of this is what I want to do, how do I go back and solve it? So one of the first things is to explicitly define like what you're really looking for. So if you kind of take the Dynamo logo backwards, it's really just a collection of shapes that evolve around 4 points and then lines between them. So it's really basic. The input is an X and Y for 4 points. So it's 8 bits of data, or not bits, but 8 points of data that you're looking for. And my dad's a geometry teacher, so I was kind of trying to explain to him what I actually do. And showing him that the geometry class I had in high school that he taught has some payoff, because there's certain things now that I've found out that we just take for granted, like when you have parallel lines and a line runs between them, that the angles are the same. And it's just intuitive now, but stuff you learned in high school is now just kind of coming back. So when you take that logo apart, it's really just 2 points. And if you can do it for 2 points, you can do it for, or if you can do it for 1 line, you can do it for 6 lines. So if I could solve this, then I knew that I could solve the rest of it. So took out my iPad and Apple Pencil, which is now my new favorite tool, and we just kind of plugged away at some geometry stuff, the whole SOHCAHTOA thing. And as we're doing this, you kind of look up some points within Dynamo. So really the inputs, it's just 2 different points. And then you're kind of solving for this abstract point down here, because I know that's 90. So what I did is I took the Y of this and the X of this, and that creates this point here to give me a right triangle. And then what I do is I collected all the points. So there's 4 different points. There's a big radius and a small radius because the Dynamo logo has a hole on each of the points. And this is what I was talking about before, where I put things together in bundles. And the reason for that, I'll show you in, yeah, we'll just open it here. And I'll tell you why I don't like it either. Because there is one, can I not open anything? I have a feeling something's off screen.
If you change your Revit file, it doesn't let you close anymore. I don't know why.
We'll just restart Dynamo. So what it does is it collects all the points within here. And then what I could do is I could copy that. I could copy that code block and push it right next to it and just connect all the points again. Because then I could just copy this back and forth, and then I drag that to where I need it. So I don't have like all these lines going everywhere from all of these points, because it's really confusing. But if I can drag, Dynamo's still opening. If I can drag this code block up to then my linear progression of groups, it makes the lines just kind of run that way rather than running all the way through. And I have no idea what's going on. Yeah, so that's the extension. I call it zip ties because that's basically what.
It's like that too, yeah. That looks just like your network closet.
Yeah, that's exactly the analogy I use. So
Yeah.
this guy right here is exactly the same as this guy right here, and then I'm just using the points that I need from it. So I'm not using everything in there. This one uses different points. This one uses different points. I'm actually going to open up. Yeah, we can come back to this. So, because that was a more advanced one. So from there, basically you're solving for 2 points, and then you're solving for the lengths of the line that you create. And then there's a node that's angled by law of cosines. So Dynamo, if you just search for it, you might find a node that solves the problem you're looking for. So I just typed in angle and then scrolled through the whole list and tried to find something. And this seemed to be what I wanted. So then I kind of went back and created how I wanted to find these 3 points. And then from there, there we go. So from there, you start doing a little bit more geometry, and all these angles are the same. So as the line rotates up, all these angles are basically staying the same, just because I can't remember the exact geometry law that's doing it, but it's kind of one of the things I was talking with my dad, like this is kind of how things are moving, but they're all staying the same. And then from that, you're taking this point and you're creating a arc by center point. So it starts in that point. It has a radius that we defined earlier. And it has a start point and an end point. So the angle, since the angles are the same, basically there is one node in here that is saying plus 90, minus 90. So it takes this angle and it adds 90 degrees or it subtracts 90 degrees. And then from that, we can create these arcs that are on there. And then from those arcs, you get curve start point, curve end point to get these 4 points right here. And then you can just line by start point, end point, just connects them up. So it's just a progression of how things are going. And then you just, again, you're containing things. Your input is coming from that code block and your output is your shape. That's right here. So one of the other things we're doing with this law of cosines, once you flip it over past 90, then you have to start doing if-then statements, because this angle right here is 60, but this angle right here is also 60. But really what I need is the angle from that line. So this should be like 120. This should be 100 or 210. So that's kind of where I had to go back and rework all my Dynamo script because it didn't work for all conditions. I really wanted one group of nodes that solved all my problems, rather than doing if-then statements, because I don't want to have to do if it's x and y, x is less than this x and x is greater than this x, and then do all this different stuff. I didn't want to have to create all these different things. So if I go back to Revit, you'll see that's a little bit different. So I found a node that's vector by 2 points, and then vector angle about axis. So this got a little bit cleaner instead of having that giant. Let's see if I can go backwards. Instead of having this big guy, it's a little bit cleaner with these. So I basically created those points and then found it. And with that, I could flip it all the way around and do 360 degrees. So the next step, which I can't remember if I have in my presentation. I'm finding it's better to do everything in PowerPoint than in Dynamo, just in case things crash, but we'll see. Yeah, so this is the redefine. So you have, instead of this, I had this. And this, what I was finding with the original is I had to specially create this node for each box. So plus 180, plus minus 270, whatever. Whereas this one, it's plus 190, minus 90, and it always works. Just in case now we're flipping and this is the angle that's going all the way down. So again, your input then is your outline. And then you can create a shape from that. So we had our little circles. You can extrude those up and then subtract them from it. And then you have your shape. And then that's just one of them. And then from the last step is you can apply color to it. And actually, the very last step is I have to translate it, because once I did all this with the 6 different things, they're on the same plane, so the colors just in Dynamo, they look really weird. So if we look at it, the full script in Dynamo, it's just the 6 different lines. So here's your input, it's just those nodes, and then your output is these guys. So things just happen to blow up in Dynamo. It's just the way it is. But as long as you can maintain an understanding of what each group is, it makes things a lot easier. I take a lot of notes too, so just pepper those throughout. It makes it easier if you ever have to hand it off, which I haven't really done too much of, but if someone else is going to be using your script, a computer coder will notate everything in their code. Not everything, but they'll notate a lot, so that when someone else comes in, they can look at it. We kind of have to approach this in the same way, so that someone can come in and easily understand it. So then again, like, what do you do? Where do you take this? So one of the things that I was looking at is what if you wanted to keep more than, or what if you wanted to have more than 4 points? So my inputs were just these sliders that created the points, and they do work. So if I run this as, oh, it's not looking at the right. If you slide these, the whole thing moves around and shifts and everything. But what if you wanted to add points to it? Am I just losing the... So could you do this in an easier way? And it kind of is the same way as the advanced strategies problem. Like, sure, I could add 6 more points and just copy things down and kind of tweak them. But what if I wanted to keep expanding it? I probably have to rethink completely how the inputs go in. The output's pretty much the same. You're taking the line and then from that line extrapolating. But if I could figure out some way of getting all these points and then creating lines, and maybe, I haven't done this, I'm just like thinking, if I can create it where they only cross with one other line, because I don't want this line, I don't want a line going from here to here. So like, how do you do that in Dynamo? Not really sure. So
Just use a while loop and implement it.
yeah.
So every time the loop on
Okay. So there's probably some filter too that you find out if things are crossing. You can filter those out if it exceeds 1 or something like that. So this is where I would explore to go, and then just kind of maybe keep building that. And then, like, what else do you want to do with it? So I took it and extracted it to CAD and created some laser cut pieces. So we have actual Dynamo logo in laser cut. So I have one for Paul and one for myself. Yeah, actually, I talked about our model shop guy last month, and I'm like, hey, if I gave you a CAD drawing, could you laser cut it for me? And today, he came to me, and he's like, hey, whatever happened to that thing? I'm like, well, I didn't have time to do it. He's like, it's going to take a half an hour. Just give me the file, and I'll do it. So I gave him the file, and half an hour later, he had a little Dynamo script, or Dynamo.
I want to see it. Nowhere to put it.
You could just hire us. We have a 30 by 42 inch laser. They are pretty fun. When I lived in California, a friend of mine worked for a company that had one, and we would just go there on Saturday nights and just laser cut things.
I totally want to do that. I came so close, and then I was like, nowhere to put it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a blast. So that's pretty much it.
Wow, that was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, once again, everyone, if you yourself or one of your coworkers has something you'd like to show, then please definitely give me your card and talk.
I just wanted to share some of the masonry